Fine, I'm 15 years too late, but I'm going to review the Twilight books. Before I get started, I want to make a few things clear. First of all, I'm going to be reviewing and criticizing the books. As of now, I have never watched any of the Twilight movies in their entirety. Of course, I've seen clips from them, but I promise you, I will not make any references to the movies in this review. Secondly, these are my thoughts about Twilight. If you like Twilight, that is fine. I rather like the novel The Thinking Woman's Guide to Real Magic by Emily Croy Barker, and that book got mixed reviews at best. I really like the play Love's Labour's Lost, which seems to be one of Shakespeare's least popular plays. Plenty of people have criticized those works, and I don't care. I still like them. In the words of George Orwell, the only true test of art is time. I am not telling anyone that they can't like Twilight. And third, I need to emphasize that I do not think the Twilight books are atrocious. I have read far, far worse. Now, let's get started. A lot of people have criticized Twilight because of the way it reinvents vampires.
In its place, we have vampires that sparkle.
It messes with the classic lore. Most famously, vampires don't sparkle.
Well, I hate to break it to you, but technically vampires don't do anything. How do I know this? Well, I'll tell you. It's because vampires don't exist.
You mean like the ones that don't exist?
Any use of vampires in a novel is, by definition, fictitious. What Bram Stoker did was great, but that doesn't mean everyone has to follow his rules. Dracula is not set in stone. I actually like the idea that vampires glow in direct sunlight, and that's why they prefer the dark. I thought that was moderately clever. And yes, you can debate whether the Twilight books remain consistent with their own rules. For example, how does Edward get Bella pregnant? But I think that is the least of the problems here. Meyer has gotten a lot of flack for her writing.
Based on the terrible books from one of the shittiest authors of all time.
Stephen King has contrasted Harry Potter with Twilight, and he stated, "The real difference is that Joe Rowling is a terrific writer, and Stephenie Meyer can't write worth a darn." And I disagree. I don't think Meyer is a bad writer. She can construct a sentence, and she can tell a coherent story. Usually. I think the biggest problem with her writing is that she is trying to be important. She wants to tell everyone a story about the perfect couple, a man and a woman who are perfect and love each other so much. I have several issues with this premise. Number one, a couple that is already perfect does not make for a very interesting story. There's not enough conflict. Number two, it comes off as extremely unrealistic. Personally, I don't believe in love at first sight. Number three, the two characters are so absorbed in themselves and in each other that they don't do enough to make the world a better place. Thus, in my opinion, they are not especially likable. Meyer is trying very hard to convey a message about something that just wasn't a very interesting idea to begin with. And what are the messages of Twilight? Apparently, the themes of these novels are life, not death, love, not lust, and the initiative to make your own choices. These are not bad messages, but she presents them as if they are shocking developments, as if no one has written about them before.
True love is the greatest thing in the world, except for nice MLT.
There are plenty of works of literature that have stunned the world and changed the way people look at things, but Twilight tries to be groundbreaking when it simply isn't. It's nowhere near as original as Meyer seems to think it is. Stargirl by Jerry Spinelli also features a teenager who becomes fascinated with another teenager who is different. A Wizard of Earthsea by Ursula Le Guin is also about an adolescent who develops great magical powers and must learn to control them. Frankenstein by Mary Shelley also explores the psychology of an alleged monster who turns out to be more sympathetic than we would have expected. In Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier, a young woman falls in love with a much older and well-connected man, and then she feels as though she does not belong in his life. All these books came out before the Twilight books. Probably the most original idea in the series is Edward's dualistic interest in Bella. He wants to drink her blood because it smells so appallingly luscious, but at the same time he is intrigued by her mind because she is the only person whose thoughts he cannot hear. Edward can hear people's thoughts, just go with it. Bella is a shield, as they later identify her. She can block the powers of other vampires. And if Bella had a truly unique personality that matched up with such a unique ability, Twilight could have hooked me in. But is Bella a particularly special person? No. Good Lord, no. As many people have pointed out, Bella has almost no identifiable personality. She moves to her father's house in Washington not out of any personal impetus, but because she wants to give her mother some space. At one point, she actually says to Edward, "As long as I'm being not smart, we'll try to be friends." Several times, she shows signs of increasing codependency on Edward, as she accepts any sense of direction he gives to her life. When Edward says that he truly cares about her, "My heart throbbed at his words, and I wanted so badly to believe them." Edward says, "You would have come," referring to his ability to lure her wherever he wants, and she responds, "Without a doubt." He tells her, "Just eat, Bella," and she does. At one point, Edward actually does hypnotize her, and she reflects, "There was no confidence in my voice. He smelled an easy victory." And I'm not saying the main character in a story has to be 20-dimensional and stun us every page with his or her psychological depth. But in Twilight, we get two very contradictory messages concerning Bella. One is that Bella has very little personality. The other is that she is one of the most special people in the world. Edward is drawn to Bella because she smells so appallingly luscious. Apparently, there is something special about her blood, which implies that there is something special about her. Bella later reflects, "There was something deeply wrong with me. Why else would my life be filled with characters from horror movies?" The vampire Arrow says, "If I hadn't smelled her through your memories, I wouldn't have believed the call of anyone's blood could be so strong." I know that Bella is only 18, but if you're going to tell us in a book that your 18-year-old protagonist is one of the most special people in the world, you need to demonstrate it. And Twilight doesn't demonstrate it. Now, I'm not going to lie. The reason why I took on this review is because of something I heard two young women saying a long time ago. When I was working at a fast food restaurant, I heard two of my coworkers talking. They were maybe 18 years old. They were talking about the Twilight books, and one of them said, "It's so much better than Harry Potter." And the other woman agreed with her. At the time, I had never read Twilight, and I hadn't given it a whole lot of thought, but after I heard this, being a Harry Potter fan myself, I decided that someday I needed to try reading Twilight, and I would find out if I was missing something. Now, I'm bringing this up now because the Twilight series and the Harry Potter series both have a common flaw. They both have a protagonist who is not terribly interesting. Harry Potter himself does not have much of a personality. But the difference is that Harry Potter has horrible things happen to him from day one, and he responds to all of it. His parents literally get murdered when he is 1 year old. For the next 10 years, he has to live with his aunt and uncle who hate him. Then he gets visited by a giant who invites him to go to a school for wizards, and Harry has to study a bunch of elaborate subjects while also learning more about the dark wizard who killed his parents. And throughout the next 7 years, he rises to all kinds of different challenges. He saves the Philosopher's Stone. He slays a monster that was turning his classmates into statues. He learns to repel soul-sucking reapers. He fights his way through a tournament, and then duels with the Dark Lord himself. He deals with corrupt government and dishonest journalism. Okay, a lot of us do that. He researches the dark art of splitting your soul apart and then travels around England looking for the different pieces of the Dark Lord's soul so Harry can destroy them. Harry doesn't have an outlook on life that really sets him apart from other people, but he gets thrust in the middle of a war between good and evil, and he responds to this ongoing conflict by learning and adapting and risking his own life to save the lives of others. In the Twilight books, almost nothing like this happens. Book 1. Bella moves to Forks, Washington, and meets a strange young man named Edward who saves her life twice. He turns out to be a vampire, and he saves her life a third time after another vampire begins to stalk her. Book 2. Edward leaves Bella because he thinks he's a danger to her. Bella mopes around until she remembers she has another friend who turns out to be a werewolf.
What'd you do that for?
Because of the full moon, I'm a werewolf, bitch.
But she still can't get over Edward, so she jumps off a cliff. No, really. Prompting Bella to find Edward and reunite with him. Book 3. Another vampire is creating an army of bloodthirsty, newborn vampires in order to overrun Forks and kill Bella because reasons. Edward's vampire family and Jacob's werewolf family join forces to fight the newborn vampires, while Bella gets caught in a love triangle between Edward and Jacob. Book 4. On her honeymoon with Edward, Bella becomes pregnant, and as soon as she gives birth, Edward injects her with venom in order to save her. Bella becomes a vampire. She develops the ability to shield other people's minds with her newfound powers, and she uses this power to help defend her family when the Vampire Council threatens them. Notice anything missing? Well, I spot a few things. Number 1, conflict. Sure, there are different sides that suspect one another, but the action of these books barely rises above a few threats and arguments. Not enough actually happens in these books. What if there had been one vampire, or perhaps another supernatural creature, who wanted to reveal the existence of vampires to the world, and Edward and or the Vampire Council had to track him down and stop him? That would have been exciting. What if Alice, a vampire who can see the future, got carried away using her powers and accidentally became a celebrity, and scientists tried to kidnap her and dissect her brain? That could have been awesome. What if Jacob set free all the animals in the zoo and some of them turned out to be shapeshifters like him, except they had amnesia and forgot who they were? What if it turned out vampires were actually shapeshifters too, imitating an ancient ice-cold species that suddenly returns and threatens us all? I swear, I could go on. So many possibilities. The characters in these books just don't do enough. Things pick up a bit in Eclipse when Victoria creates the army of newborns, but other than that, most of Twilight is just the characters discussing what is best for them, debating it, shouting at each other. It gets old. Exposition alone does not a novel make. The second thing that's missing here, Bella giving a realistic response to this world she has discovered. She finds out that Edward is a vampire and that he must restrain himself from sucking her appallingly luscious blood. There are many ways a girl could respond to this discovery. Falling head over heels in love with Edward practically overnight is not the first response I would pick. She wants him to turn her into a vampire so she can be with him forever. So there's nothing else in your life you want to hold on to? Friends, family, career options? No? Just pushing all of that out of the way so you can literally spend eternity with a man you just met. I'm sorry, but she's not making the world a better place, and she's not fulfilling herself as a person. She says to him, "You are my life. You're the only thing it would hurt me to lose." And she reflects, "I was getting better at this. It was easy to admit how much I needed him." Then at the end, she says, "I love you more than everything else in the world combined." Oh, but she knows Edward is the right man for him. How is she so sure of this? Because the novel is missing a third thing, the ability to criticize its male protagonist in any way. Edward is simply perfect. He still had his face in his hand, and he was as still as if he'd been carved from the stone his skin resembled. Again, the fabric clung to his perfectly muscled chest. It was a colossal tribute to his face that it kept my eyes away from his body. Looking more like a Greek god than anyone had a right to, Edward was waiting for me. He was smiling, relaxed, and, as usual, perfect and beautiful to an excruciating degree. His white shirt was sleeveless, and he wore it unbuttoned, so that the smooth white skin of his throat flowed uninterrupted over the marble contours of his chest. His perfect musculature no longer merely hinted at behind concealing clothes. He was too perfect, I realized with a piercing stab of despair. There was no way this godlike creature could be meant for me. Edward looked just as beautiful as he did in real life, staring at me out of the picture with the warm eyes I'd missed for the past few days. It was almost uncanny that anyone could look so beyond description. No 1,000 words could equal this picture. Every second that he was here, so close, his flawless face glowing in the dim light from the numbers on my alarm clock, was precious and not to be wasted. Time had not made me immune to the perfection of his face, and I was sure that I would never take any aspect of him for granted. My eyes traced over his pale white features, the hard square of his jaw, the softer curve of his full lips, twisted up into a smile now, the straight line of his nose, the sharp angle of his cheekbones, the smooth marble span of his forehead, partially obscured by a tangle of rain-darkened bronze hair. I saved his eyes for last, knowing that when I looked into them I was likely to lose my train of thought. I felt oddly buoyant as I walked from Spanish toward the cafeteria, and it wasn't just because I was holding hands with the most perfect person on the planet. His smile still knocked the breath out of me. He was so beautiful that it made it hard sometimes to think about anything else. I leaned into him, ducking my head under his arm and cuddling into his side. It probably felt similar to snuggling with Michelangelo's David, except that this perfect marble creature wrapped his arms around me to pull me closer.
Gorgeous. He has a face that looks like it was carved by angels.
He sounds dreamy.
I could never for a second forget that I was holding someone more angel than man in my arms. I never got over the shock of how perfect his body was, white, cool, and polished as marble. I ran my hand down his stone chest now, tracing across the flat planes of his stomach, just marveling. All I really saw was Edward's face. It filled my vision and overwhelmed my mind. His eyes were a buttery, burning gold. His perfect face was almost severe with the depth of his emotion. The pallid light of the moon turned his skin a perfect white, like the sand, like the moon itself, and made his wet hair black as the ocean. How many times had I stared at Edward and marveled over his beauty? How many hours, days, weeks of my life had I spent dreaming about what I then deemed to be perfection? I thought I'd known his face better than my own. I'd thought this was the one sure physical thing in my whole world, the flawlessness of Edward's face. It was a surprising sensual experience to observe Edward's hunting. His smooth spring was like the sinuous strike of a snake. His hands were so sure, so strong, so completely inescapable. His full lips were perfect as they parted gracefully over his gleaming teeth. He was glorious. I could really appreciate him now, could properly see every beautiful line of his perfect face, of his long, flawless body. I could taste his pure, vivid scent on my tongue, and feel the unbelievable silkiness of his marble skin. If I hadn't seen him undressed, I would have sworn there was nothing more beautiful than Edward in his khakis and pale beige pullover. Edward's lips were like a shot of some addictive chemical straight into my nervous system. I was instantly craving more. I don't have a whole lot to add to these quotations. They speak for themselves. My God, it gets so old. Bella describes vampires as a higher form of life, and this could be fine if only she didn't keep telling us how perfect they are, because perfect is boring. In a way, Twilight reminds me of the Marvel comics, in which superheroes and mutants are the new dominant people, and ordinary Homo sapiens will become the new Neanderthals. Except in Twilight, the dominant people are pale, sullen vampires who are nearly immortal and essentially have nothing to lose. I will admit I like the character Alice, who can see the future. She's fun and witty, but Twilight lacks any rich, idiosyncratic characters, the type that can make a book memorable. I cannot think of one character in Twilight whom I would enjoy portraying in a production, unless they gave me permission to rewrite every single one of my lines. Is this a Bella that I smell before me? To bite or not to bite? That is the question. And then we get to another issue I have with these books, the part where Meyer's writing just gets weird. I was an empty shell, like a vacant house, condemned. For months I'd been utterly uninhabitable. Now I was a little improved. The front room was in better repair. But that was all, just the one small piece. He deserved better than that. Better than a one-room, falling-down fixer-upper. No amount of investment on his part could put me back in working order. In New Moon, Bella starts deliberately putting herself in danger in order to have visions of Edward telling her to be careful. No, I am not making this up. This possibly unhealthy habit leads to several passages that made me laugh out loud. And then to discover the key to the hallucinations. At least, I hope I had. I was going to test the theory as soon as possible. Maybe they'd get through with me quickly in the ER, and I could try again tonight. I'd had the most amazing hallucination today. My velvet-voiced delusion had yelled at me for almost 5 minutes before I'd hit the brake too abruptly and launched myself into the tree. I'd take whatever pain that would cause me tonight without complaint. But it had been days since I'd heard Edward's voice. That was probably part of the problem. I was addicted to the sound of my delusions. It made things worse if I went too long without them. Jumping off a cliff was certain to remedy the situation. Was I dying again then? I didn't like it. This wasn't as good as the last time.
What?
In the other books, we get some other truly bizarre passages. I wondered if it wasn't a little foolish to sit around, weak and tasty, waiting for the next disaster. It seemed too dangerous to be human, just begging for trouble. Someone like me shouldn't be human. Huh? Edward says, I don't think you realize how much easier it will be for me, Bella, when I don't have to concentrate all the time on not killing you. I think that's the first time a man ever said that to his fiancée. Later, Bella fantasizes about Edward turning her into a vampire. It was childish, but I liked the idea that his lips would be the last good thing I would feel. Even more embarrassingly, something I would never say aloud, I wanted his venom to poison my system. It would make me belong to him in a tangible, quantifiable way. They genuinely deserve each other.
What? What are you talking about?
Bella says to Jacob, there is definitely a chance that I might walk away from this. If I believed myself to be in grave danger, I don't think I would describe my condition with the terminology of a stock analyst. The thought was loaded with the heaviness of her despair. What? Was he really so selfless that he would try to protect me with his own life from doing something in an uncontrolled split second that I would regret in agony forever? She sounds like a high school drama student applying for a job at a newspaper, and she wrote her own obituary as a writing sample. I don't think she would get the job. Bella describes Alice. Her eyes were halfway there and halfway locked on the future, wide, staring, filling her thin face till they seemed to overflow it. Looking into her eyes was like looking out of a grave from the inside. I was buried in the terror and despair and agony of her gaze. Give me a year and maybe I'll think of a retort to this one. I can't tell if it's brilliant or meaningless. During the judgment at Nurum Forks, Caius hisses at Arrow. How can you abide this infamy? Why do I stand here impotently in the face of such an outrageous crime, covered by such a ridiculous deception? Pretentious dialogue does not make you seem any more authoritative. And finally, my favorite. Bella marvels at the sheer bliss of her newfound life. I imagined how the thread of my life might look in the fate's loom. Who knew but that it actually existed? I was sure my thread must have changed color. I thought it had probably started out as a nice beige, something supportive and non-confrontational, something that would look good in the background. Now it felt like it must be bright crimson, or maybe glistening gold. The tapestry of family and friends that wove together around me was a beautiful, glowing thing, full of their bright, complementary colors. Okay, first of all, what do you mean, who knew but that it actually existed? Before any of this happened, did you think you didn't have a fate at all? You thought nothing would ever happen to you? You would stay in the same place and do the same thing every day for the rest of your life? And then comparing you and your friends to different colors, is it just me, or does this sound shallow, focusing purely on outer appearances? I want to make it clear that I actually do like a few passages in the Twilight books. Here's one of them when Edward and Alice are playing chess. They'd sat there nearly motionless, staring at the board, while Alice foresaw the moves he would make, and he picked the moves she would make in return out of her head. They played most of the game in their minds. I think they'd each moved 2 pawns when Alice suddenly flicked over her king and surrendered. But then, we get to the last problem that I have with these books. Wordiness. Stephenie Meyer will spell out these long descriptions of processes that really do not require much explanation. I ate slowly, chewing every bite with care. When I was done, I washed the bowl and spoon, dried them, and put them away. Is that how you eat breakfast and then clean up? Thank you so much for spelling that out for me. My pulse was thudding in my ears. It drummed hyperactively under my palm. I felt an unpleasant surge of enthusiasm at his smile. I realized that I was pleased to see him. This knowledge surprised me. I had the sense that I'd been asleep for a very long time. My body was stiff, like I hadn't moved once through all that time either. Of course you weren't moving if you were asleep for a long time.
I get it.
I'd been plagued by a persistent, uncomfortable intrusion of a specific mental image. It popped into my thoughts at regular intervals, like some annoying alarm clock set to sound every half hour, filling my head with the image of Jacob's face, crumpled in pain. Recurring image in your head, we get it. I heard the quick gasp, gasp, gasp of the air dragging through my lips, but I couldn't stop it. It looked like the school was shaking, like there was an earthquake, but I knew it was my own trembling that caused the illusion. Yes, that's how anxiety affects a person. We get it. Jacob says, I heal fast, and then we get Bella's description. I'd seen the long gash clearly, seen the blood that flowed into the sink. The rust and salt smell of it had almost pulled me under. It should have needed stitches. It should have taken days to scab over and then weeks to fade into the shiny pink scar that marked his skin now. I love how she uses a painfully long passage in order to convey how quickly something happens. Billy began telling the story in his rich, deep voice. The words poured out with precision, as if he knew them by heart, but also with feeling and a subtle rhythm, like poetry performed by its author. He is good at telling a story that he knows by heart. We get it.
Just like the story. I get it.
Jacob agonizes. I hated the thing that was hurting her. It wasn't enough for the monster to beat her from the inside out. No, it was starving her too, probably just looking for something to sink its teeth into, a throat to suck dry. Since it wasn't big enough to kill anyone else yet, it settled for sucking Bella's life from her. I could tell them exactly what it wanted. Death and blood. Blood and death. This thing is hurting Bella. We get it. Bella pines. I couldn't see Charlie right away. What could I possibly say to him? How could I even begin? I was furtively glad that I had some excuses for putting things off for a while. As much as I wanted to find some way to keep Charlie in my life, I was terrified of that first meeting. You're afraid of seeing your father again. We get it. Bella thinks in relief. Rosalie grinned at me, and I was glad to see that the new comradeship between us was still there in her smile. I hadn't been entirely sure it would last after Renesmee's life was no longer tied to my own, but maybe we had fought together on the same side long enough that we would always be friends now. I'd made the same choice she would have made if she'd been in my shoes. That seemed to have washed away her resentment for all my other choices. You and Rosalie are friends now. We get it. Also, how does Rosalie have comradeship in her smile? Did she forget to floss? Do vampires ever floss? I don't think Meyer ever addresses that point of dental care for vampires. I may never sleep again. We were doomed then, weren't we? There was no hope at all. Not one ray, one flicker that might have convinced Alice that she had a chance at our side. The bright morning air seemed thicker suddenly, blacker, as if physically darkened by my despair. You're worried. We get it.
Yeah, we get it. Ain't got no...
Then there are other times when Meyer explains the same thing several times using different words, just to make sure that we get her drift. As I watched, his frozen eyes melted. The gold became liquid again, molten, burning down into mine with an intensity that was overwhelming. Melting, burning, intense, and it's overwhelming too. I had no idea that being burned could feel overwhelming. Effortlessly, without a conscious command to the muscles around my lips, my answering smile spread across my face. A smile, by definition, involves the lips, the muscles around the lips, and the face. You do not have to spell any of this out for us. I was sitting home, missing him more every hour. I was lonely, worried, bored, perforated. This was so real that it sang out loud with joy and life and true love. I stared at him, wishing more than anything that the future would never happen, that this moment would last forever, or, if it couldn't, that I would stop existing when it did. I knew I would not panic again. The next time something came at us, I would be ready, an asset, not a liability. So, you're ready? Are you sure you're ready? The pathless way he took began to climb more and more steeply, but it didn't slow him down. He leaped easily from rock to rock, not seeming to need his hands at all. His perfect balance reminded me of a mountain goat. Okay, you had the words there for one good sentence. He leaped across the rocky path with the perfect balance of a mountain goat. Who was the editor here? Jacob describes Edward. There was a little life in his dead voice, a spark of something, not hope exactly, but maybe the desire to hope. And again Jacob describes Edward. His voice was ice, was dead, fierce and unthinking, like he was a machine. Bella struggles with becoming a vampire. Reality was red, and it felt like I was being sawed in half, hit by a bus, punched by a prizefighter, trampled by bulls, and submerged in acid all at the same time. Okay, I'm going to be honest, I kind of like that passage. Bella tells us, I felt I knew the answer to Carlyle's question, and yet at the same time I didn't. Renesmee was the reason why, I was sure. Somehow I'd known from the very beginning that they would come for her. My subconscious had warned me before I'd known I was carrying her. It felt oddly expected now, as if I'd somehow always known that the Volturi would come to take my happiness from me. You saw this coming. We get it. It's like reading every single entry in the dictionary for the word anticipate. We were doomed then, weren't we? There was no hope at all, not one ray. One flicker that might have convinced Alice she had a chance at our side. The bright morning air seemed thicker, suddenly, blacker, as if physically darkened by my despair. You're worried. We get it. And then, sometimes Meyer will just use the same word again and again. In a lot of ways, living with Charlie was like having my own place, and I found myself reveling in the aloneness instead of being lonely. It didn't surprise me that my delusion of Edward was there. He owed me that much, considering that I was dying. I was surprised by how sure that knowledge was. I was going to drown. I was drowning. Bella tells Jacob, I can't be happy without him. Jacob says, you could be happy if you let go. You could be happy with me. Bella insists, I don't want to be happy with anyone but him. Have you ever heard of a thesaurus? There are other words besides happy. Why wasn't I stopping this? Worse than that, why couldn't I find in myself even the desire to want to stop? What did it mean that I didn't want him to stop? Of course, I already knew the answer. Of course I did. Of course. 5 lines later, she whispers, Of course. The first words of Breaking Dawn are, No one is staring at you, I promised myself. No one is staring at you. No one is staring at you. Again, I am not calling Stephenie Meyer a bad writer, but as a writer myself, it drives me up the wall when people take this and call it great writing. Personally, I do not recommend reading the Twilight books. They're not terrible, they're just pretentious and unoriginal and mediocre with a main character who accomplishes very little in the course of an entire saga. If I had to choose a favorite out of the 4 books, it would be Eclipse. Eclipse easily has the most tightly constructed plot. It comes closest to accomplishing what a decent novel ought to accomplish. Have only what it needs and show how the different elements of the story connect to one another. Not that Eclipse does it especially well. There are plenty of problems with that book, but it has the most conflict in it, and it finishes most of what it starts. I saw Eclipse as a step in the right direction. Breaking Dawn, sadly, did not continue this trend. The last book has way too much exposition, not enough action. So that's my review of Twilight, New Moon, Eclipse, and Breaking Dawn by Stephenie Meyer. Do you agree with my assessment? Do you disagree? Leave a comment below and feel free to subscribe. This is Philip the Librarian, signing off.